I am Daniel Minty, a cognitive behavioral therapist, teacher, and writer. I'm an adjunct faculty member at Georgetown University School of Medicine and host the weekly online webinar, All Things CBT. My remarks today owe a debt of gratitude to the work of our farming colleagues, Wes Jackson and Wendell Berry. Cognitive behavioral therapy posits that belief is the ground of experience. When activated, beliefs produce thoughts. Thoughts generate emotion. Emotion drives behavior that creates data in support of our beliefs. In this way, belief shapes perception. We believe in gravity, that things fall from the sky to the earth. So though lightning strikes actually start on earth and travel into the sky, our belief system leads us to perceive lightning traveling in the opposite direction. What does belief arise from? At the end of the day, belief arises, like lightning, from soil. Earth itself is the ground of belief. And this relationship is reciprocal. Belief springs from the soil and has profound impacts on soil. Believing that soil or air or water is inexhaustible leads to thoughts, emotions, and behaviors that grievously exhaust earth, air, and water. And exhaustion is Earth's current state of affairs. The term perennial agriculture describes a relationship to soil that is the opposite of exhaustive. That is, a relationship that is sustainable. It's been said that a measure of any society is the quality of its soil. A beneficent society builds soil. A malevolent society exhausts soil. Thus, perennial agriculture speaks to a higher level of organization than do terms like organic or inorganic. We could call this higher level of organization wisdom, or as Alexander Pope describes it, the genius of the place. Perennial philosophy describes the transcultural, transtemporal wisdom handed down to us from the beginning of human culture. Perennial philosophy, the ground of CBT, teaches that wise beliefs, that is, beliefs accurately reflecting the structure of reality, set the stage for sustainable human life. CBT, finally, helps patients discover, embrace, and express wisdom. What is the heart of this wisdom? The heart is the fact that what is good for one is good for all. What's good for one tree is good for all trees. What's good for one race of people is good for all races of people. It's this goodness that, once seen, appreciated, and expressed, is the universal solvent for anxiety and depression, for the greedy, hateful, and ignorant thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Buddhism tells us poison life on earth. Rebecca.
Well, that is a very interesting and very different perspective than the one I usually hear. It is true that I don't tend towards CBT in my thinking, but there was quite a lot as I was trying to make some notes as you were talking. And what I've been thinking a little bit about, as you were saying, beliefs and where do beliefs come from? is their relationship also to the political systems that we live in. It's a complex relationship, I think, between the political systems that we're living in and the psychological systems that get generated and support those political systems or in opposition to those political systems. And I think what I'm feeling very aware of after COP26 and after the Rittenhouse trial verdict is that there's human capacity for both terrifying belief systems and very rigid belief systems, and also very flexible, collaborative belief systems. And I think we're living in a moment where we don't know which direction we're ultimately headed as a species, frankly. And I find myself thinking a lot, both at the systemic level and at the individual level, about how in this moment there is such profound existential fear, pretty much across the board. And that the ways people respond to those existential fears, I think in analytic terms often, through defenses. And in those defenses, they compartmentalize, they exceptionalize, they go into denial modes. They do all sorts of things to keep the fear at bay because we don't live in a culture that quite knows how to handle the enormity of what we're facing existentially. And so I find the role of climate psychologists and the role of activists to be somewhat the same in this context, which is to try to provide space to feel, as Heather and I have spoken before, to feel the feelings that this existential crisis brings up. Because I think so many people don't have spaces to do that in a way that is soft. They run away, they defend, they compartmentalize, they blame, all sorts of different things. And for the field of climate psychology, if we allow spaces for people to acknowledge their fears, to acknowledge their guilt, to acknowledge any shame that might come up about their own role or connection to the extractive world or the exhaustive world that you just spoke of. If we give room to do that in a non-judgmental place, then I think people are softer internally and can find ways to collaborate and to tap into the parts of themselves that care. Unfortunately, and there's some writing by Sally Weintraub who talks a lot about this. Unfortunately, we live in a political and economic system that does not take care of those parts of ourselves that care, that take the parts of ourselves that want to connect. In fact, it thrives on the parts of ourselves that want to acquire and extract and divide and sequester for ourselves in a moment of scarcity and or perceived moments. It's an interesting thing, actually, a perception of both scarcity, so we need to grab it, and permanent capacity to expand. It creates both, interestingly. And I think the stakes are very, very high. There was an article in The Guardian today about how the far right is no longer in denial mode about climate change, but is beginning to be able to tap into the anxiety that we are all feeling and the existential fears that we're all feeling. And they will be offering their way to respond to the alienated and entitled stance that people feel. And their way will be divisive. Their way will be in a world that's getting increasingly scary. We're going to make sure that we protect ourselves and our own, and they will define themselves very narrowly. That's terrifying. And so for me, again, both as a climate psychologist and also an activist, it's trying to tap into the other parts of ourselves that are equally on display in the incredible movements outside of COP26, the people's climate movements all over the world, the global South, within the US, within Europe, and talk about ways of connecting and living outside of fear. But I'm worried. I'm admittedly very worried. When I offer these spaces and when I provide these spaces in the forms of climate cafes or other things, I go into my own places of wavering between hope and despair. And uncertainty is a very difficult thing around this stuff to hold. And I think people try to collapse into one or the other and often react to those who are in the other space. So people who try to maintain hope react very vehemently against the people who are feeling more despairing, and they label them as doomerists. And the people who are feeling more despairing find those who find hope kind of Pollyannish. And I think that there needs to be a capacity to feel all and recognize that we are all part of the human system trying to react and understand and show grace and compassion for any feeling that shows up. So I think I'll leave it there. And I would love to hear what Heather has to say.
Thanks to both of you, so beautifully and soberly put. Rebecca and I have had some conversations about the importance of making space for climate grief. This totally normal human tendency to ward off and, as you said, use defense mechanisms, denial, keeps us from being present with what's happening, as you said, Daniel, from having beliefs that are in sync enough with reality that we can make choices that are adaptive. And I think we are seeing a swing from sort of denialism and then, into nihilism, right, would be the other kind of scary side. And we are not yet there. There was a graph on the front page of the New York Times a few weeks ago that showed the impact of the 2014 Paris Accords, that we have successfully reduced emissions. Like, we were on track towards a 4 degrees Celsius rise, and that's down to like a little under 3. I mean, we'd want to keep it at 1.5 to really prevent serious harm. To do that, we'd have to cut emissions by about 45% in the next 10 years, which politically doesn't seem feasible. But if countries lived up to their pledges from the COP26, we'd be at around 1.8 to 2, which is still rough, but is much better than where we're at now. So indulging in denial is probably increasingly untenable for many, but the lure of nihilism is, I think, quite dangerous. So, which is partly why I'm so excited by your work, Rebecca, because you're so active and brave and willing to look and see and feel and take action. And I think that's what's so important, is that we stay engaged. And as you said, making space for the parts of us that want to connect, and using kind of all of our soft power to hold open the possibility, because the door is not yet closed. Nancy, I would love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you, Heather. I'm Nancy Minty, and my biggest claim to fame is that I'm the sister of Daniel Minty. But I'm also the founder of 2 nonprofit organizations, the Inner City Law Center, which serves the poor and unhoused of Los Angeles, and Uncommon Good, which has created innovative programs in education, community health, sustainable architecture, and urban farming for and with low-income communities. Now, on the subject at hand, I think that there's great truth in something that Lao Tzu said in the Tao Te Ching, that for every force, there is a counterforce. Now, all of us on this panel were born a relatively short time after the first atomic bombs were dropped on human beings, which surely marked the descent of humanity into the most brutal and brutish epoch in history, an era in which violence and ecological destruction has reached its deepest descent into darkness. So what's the counterforce to this force of darkness? Well, conventional thinking would have us believe that the very people who created these problems, the puppet politicians and their international financier backers, those masters of disaster capitalism, are going to save us. I must confess, I find this laughable. At the recent COP26 climate conference in Scotland, these masters of disaster capitalism flew into the country via 400 private jets. The US delegation was led by Biden's climate czar, a man who one wag said has the personal carbon footprint of an entire US Panzer division. These masters of disaster capitalism are now demanding $152 trillion to fix the problems that they have created. This is simply a cynical ruse for further bankrupting the planet, in my opinion. So what would be the real counterforce to these forces of darkness? I've come to believe that this is a David versus Goliath struggle, and that the counterforce is those on this planet now who are working to raise the consciousness of humanity. You know, as you, Dan, said so beautifully, the world around us will reflect our consciousness. That is the ironclad law of creation. So the counterforce is those of you who are teaching people how to be the master of their minds, not the slaves of their minds, and to be at peace, so that peace will be reflected on earth. It's also people like me who are creating small but evocative models of what a newly imagined world could be. The power, this counterforce, is always in human consciousness. Now, this consciousness is largely asleep in humanity today, but there are signs that it is awakening. And so rather than despairing over the state of the world, I'm glad to be able to facilitate, at least in some small way, this awakening.
Oh, thanks to each of you for sharing what you've shared with us so far. Feel like I'm sitting in excellent company, and seems that sitting in excellent company is one of the things that we can do to raise our own consciousness and offer that raise in consciousness to those in our households, our neighborhoods, our communities, our professional organizations. Nancy, you were speaking to these evocative models that you've spent your entire adult life building across the platform, from legal rights to healthcare to whole earth building. And most recently, a project that you and I have partnered with, low intensity CBT. These divisions that run through our social lives with each other run right through the class divide. If you have money, you have access to quality mental health care. If you don't have money, you're pretty much on your own. And I wonder, Nancy, if you could speak for a few minutes to your understanding of how our low intensity CBT project there in the Pomona Valley in California is raising consciousness amongst the participants in the project and others in your community.
Sure, Dan, and I'd like to start with a huge thank you to you and to Heather and to the others on your team who have helped bring this model to us. You know, I've been doing this work for over 4 decades now in low-income communities, trying to create structures of justice and equity. And the 2 forms of healthcare that have always been the most difficult to obtain in the community have been dental and mental. And, you know, the pandemic really brought this into a great sense of urgency for us. You know, we had 2 young people in our program try and commit suicide, and a mother who ended up, you know, in a psychiatric hospital because the normal stresses of poverty were intensified as the lockdowns and the job losses and the hunger, you know, the wolf approached the doors, you know. So we knew we had to do something. And when you told me about the LICBT project around the world and how it was bringing this transformative mental health care to the poorest communities on the planet, and and in particular, how the analysis of these programs were showing that the results obtained by the lay mental health workers who were delivering the CBT to their communities rivaled those of the results that professionals were obtaining with their clients. I thought, we got to have us some of this. So when I approached you, you very graciously offered to help us bring the first LICBT pilot project to the United States, which we have done. And it's tremendously exciting for us because it has turned out to resonate very powerfully in our community, which is primarily very low-income immigrants from Mexico and Central America. And to tie the threads together, a number of years ago in our book club that we run for the parents, where they read books in Spanish that their children are reading in English to foster the culture of reading, we introduced the book The Four Agreements by Don Miguel Ruiz, who is a Mexican doctor and also comes from a family of Toltec healers. And in that book, he talks about 4 basic principles of Toltec wisdom, which resonated so powerfully with our families that they said that this was their favorite book of all of the books that we've read over the decades with them. And as I read the book myself, I realized that it was basically CBT, how to, not be at the mercy of negative thoughts and emotions. And so when this program first, came to us, we connected with Victoria Chicorel, as you know, in Mexico City, and she became the trainer via Zoom of the women in our community who are now delivering the CBT to members of our community. And it turned out to be a very beautiful relationship and a very powerful one. And at the end of this first year, we hope to have Julie analyze the results and hope and expect that we will see the same powerful impacts and results that you have seen in other parts of the world with this program. And again, it's just been one of the great joys of my life to have this life-giving, spirit-giving, powerful healing tool brought into my beloved community. So I thank you all for that so very much.
Had the pleasure of a site visit to our program a couple months ago. And per usual, the lobby was stuffed with produce, fall produce now, that Nancy's programs have grown, organic produce that is then made available to the community to purchase, or if they are unable to afford it, simply to take home to their families. So the building that we're working out of is made of soil. And I experience your work, Nancy, as probably being as vertically integrated on the side of justice of any work that I know. Starts down under the soil and goes right up into the atmosphere. So a lot of connections here between our relationships to our thoughts, our feelings, each other, the soil. Wonder, Rebecca, if you have questions or comments for any of us. Also, could you tell us a little bit, Rebecca, about what it is that you're up to these days?
Just the work that I am doing right now is trying to develop an organization. It's called the Climate Psychology Alliance, which is trying to reach out to clinicians around the country who have been moved by the climate crisis at various different stages of their own life and are aware that how we approach this crisis, as we've been talking about, is crucial in whether or not we can confront it and deal with it and adapt and mitigate in all of those different ways. And I think what's exciting is that my role in this organization is that I get a chance to connect with a lot of people who are interested in volunteering and signing up and being part. And it's really pretty extraordinary how all over the country there are people who are wanting to get involved and who have done already their own enormous levels of thinking and putting together their own presentations and putting together their own syllabi for classes and putting together their own groups to talk to people. The ideas that are percolating all over the country show precisely that we do have a capacity to care and a capacity to connect, and how to give more room for those people. And so as much as I sometimes tend towards a kind of fearful place, the work I'm doing connects me to places that can respond to that pretty well. But the goal I have is to have the field of mental health be very climate informed and climate aware, and to be able to then use the stories that people generate in their psychotherapy offices or as they reach out to activist groups and try to provide mental health support, that those stories can then generate greater awareness in their community for what's needed to be done, how to connect to schools, to teach more climate informed education systems, which can be integrated in the entire educational process as far as I'm concerned, but to use those ground up stories to generate community awareness and advocacy and change along the lines of what we're all talking about. So.
Well, thanks, Rebecca, for your words and for your work. Nothing more important for us to be addressing as clinicians than this life in this great state of uncertainty. No one knows what's coming down the pike. And I think that sets the foundation for much of our experience, thinking, focus of our attention. I wonder, Heather, what's on your mind as we sit with each other here today?
Well, I feel a feeling of sober hope. It's really an honor to be with the three of you who I know have huge hearts and done really committed action in this direction. And Nancy, I love what you're saying about this other force that's very much present, and what can we do in the mental health community to facilitate that, and that force that's already present, and allow people to come together and build their own communities, build resilience, and take whatever political power they're able to take, because I think our system is so disenfranchising to so many. Yeah, I just think there's something so in sync with what we are doing in our individual treatment rooms and this larger project, right? And this part of what we're talking about is kind of widening the focus or opening the aperture from just what's happening with this one person, that process, right? How can we expand our view to be facilitating that process more broadly? And Rebecca, I'd love to hear more about the climate cafes you're hosting. What are you doing there?
Well, I've done, how many have I done? Maybe 4 of them, and I'm doing another one coming up soon with parents. There was I don't know if you guys have seen this study that just came out about youth anxiety globally, but the level of anxiety in the generations 18 to 25 is astronomical, and it is affecting profound life choices about whether or not to have children, and whether they are feeling as if the larger macro world is taking care of them, certainly including the political leadership, but also school systems, the places that they look to be held and taken care of. Are they doing anything? Are they doing enough? Are they naming the problem even? And in many, many places, there aren't people doing enough. They aren't naming the problem. They are looking sort of 1 foot ahead of themselves and not thinking about how to raise these issues. And part of my thinking is that's because they're also afraid. School administrators are no different from the rest of us. Other larger systems are no different from the rest of us. People are afraid. People are scared. People don't know how to talk about it. And so, for example, one of the researchers that was involved in that study happens to live near me. And he and I are putting together a talk coming up in January where we're going to be presenting the outcomes of that study in terms of youth anxiety and its connection to a failure to respond adequately in the political system. And then we're going to talk about it from a parenting perspective, about what does it mean to take care of our children. If we are afraid of these issues, how can we talk with our children about them? And it's coming actually from an attachment perspective, that we need to be able to touch these parts of ourselves if we're going to be able to touch those parts of our children. That if we can hold our own fears, if we can hold our own anxieties, then we will be open enough to be able to hold those for our children and provide some way of connection, and some way of I don't want to say action, because that sounds awfully activist speak, and that's not actually what I mean in this context, but to instead of going inward and drawing in, drawing out from our children, drawing out to the community, drawing out and connecting. And so we are going to put together what's called a climate cafe of the people who've been at this talk. And what that is, it's about a 45-minute, mostly unguided conversation with trauma-informed people leading it, to allow the conversation to deepen about what are your worst fears? What are you most scared of? When you think about climate, what happens to you? What happens to your body? Where do you go? And it gives room for people to talk about these things they keep at bay quite often. And in keeping at bay, it stops them from taking a whole lot of action. And what I have found in them is that afterwards, I mean, there's a lot of tears in them. There's a lot of silence and kind of looking down. But when people come out of them, they are usually actually laughing, feeling more connected, planning ways to get together, whether it's book clubs or outside the grocery store or whatever other ways it is it's freeing up that space that's been locked into compartments and denial and all of those other things. It frees up the space and makes them much more able to speak with their children, for example, or be the person at the party that says, hey, what's going on at this crisis? What can we do about it? As opposed to being afraid to be the only one talking about it. It's really trying to break some of that logjam that happens internally. So far, they're pretty profound, but not nearly as heavy on the outside when you come out of them as one would imagine. Facing our fears.
Thanks, Rebecca. I'm thinking of how solidarity has encouraged me through my life. Maybe my first experience of solidarity was a Take Back the Night March in San Francisco back in the 70s, where we took to the streets and was walking with women who were adults and told me, this is the first time I felt I could walk down a street at night in San Francisco. That together we can do things that when we consider doing on our own are really scary. So that finding common cause and fellow travelers seems to be a first order of business and probably reflects the state of affairs on this planet, which is about interdependent co-arising. We're all in this together. One of us would be here unless all of us were here. And it's a bit of a koan there. What does that mean in terms of our relationships with each other, particularly if our next door neighbor has a profoundly different worldview, is making profoundly different choices? How do we acknowledge the fact that that person exists because I exist because that family exists? Wonder, looking at our time here, if there'd be some closing comments from the three of you about the topics we've touched on today and the possibilities that you see for us as a community with these concerns going forward. Wonder, Nancy, would you perhaps lead off?
Sure, Dan, I'm oddly hopeful. And that's not to diminish the, the despair that we've discussed today. I certainly feel and have felt that, the great sequoias, the great redwoods in California have always been my spiritual totems. They're my beloved, manifestations of nature, and in the most recent fires, the tiny remnant of them that still exists was diminished by 20% more, so that is deeply hurtful. But oddly, I feel this hope. And if I had to pinpoint why, I think I would point to a couple of things. I was talking to a friend who was a liberal Catholic the other day, and she was saying, the churches are the mainline, Christian churches are dying. There you go in and there's just a bunch of, a few elderly people with gray hair and she says, I worry about the, as the religious community dies away, about the effects in the society of morality and ethics, and where is all that going to go when we've lost these teaching institutions? And I said, boy, I don't see that. What I see is a tremendous spiritual awakening on the planet. When I think back like to the 1980s, I remember that if you said anything about spirit or God or anything that wasn't of the material, you would be canceled. You would be considered an idiot. That was not a subject, that educated people would allow to be brought forth and entertained. And now, the culture seems to be God saturated. You have spiritual yoga, you have spiritual, this, you have spiritual that, and it's just not any dogma or religion as such, but people getting in touch with something other than the material, that spirit within them and within creation that gives us the power to do so much and to create so much. And so I find that, tremendously hopeful. I also see people everywhere creating new structures. And, I'm getting excited as I talk about this because I find it very exciting. My whole life, I've worked with people all across the political spectrum. I say, I don't care what your politics are. If you want to help kids, if you want to help families, come on, let's get to work. And so on our board, we've had anarchists, Greens, Democrats, Republicans, Libertarians. And my only rule is, we're not going to talk politics. We're just going to work together on solutions. And I see in all of these sectors, resilient new systems being created, and especially among the poor, because the poor have always had to be resilient, because they've always had to depend upon each other and depend upon their flexibility to create new systems when they are denied access to the corridors of power or money that the rest of us might have access to. And I'm seeing that now in the education system, in your LICBT, programs, and in so many ways, these little sprouts of hope coming up, these alternative models emerging from the ashes and the rubble of the old. When gay marriage was legalized in California, I had the privilege of officiating at the wedding of two friends of mine who had been a couple for about 40 years. And finally, they were able to get married. And what I said, at the time was, love always wins eventually. And that's not a platitude. I believe that with every fiber of my being, that love is the most powerful force in the universe. And that, if we stay true to that, keep that as our North Star, we will win eventually. All will be well eventually. And so, as I contemplate these things, they give me great hope. And I try to communicate that to others in this time, as you say, of where there's so much palpable fear and despair. But I think there's great reason and very solid reason for hope as well.
Thanks, Nancy. If someone with as good a head on her shoulders and her eyes as wide open as you as your eyes are, is feeling hopeful. I'm going to go with hope too. Heather, any closing comments?
Yeah, I do feel inspired. And I think, for me, my personal antidote to despair is to get involved and take action and find connection and speak up and start, moving my body. And I just think you guys have modeled that beautifully in terms of, we can do this. Those are things that we can do. We can do them today. That wolf of nihilism is also at the door, and I think we can gently tell it not today.
I don't think I'm going to land in one place or the other. I think I will allow myself to go back and forth depending on where I put my gaze, which I think is actually an important part of it too, is that I try to focus on a lot of different places and try not to look too far down and not too far ahead. And yet there will be days where I get very worried and I look at the political systems. I just traveled to Vienna and Budapest and Prague and went through the Nazi museums and the Stalin museums. And I do believe that there are capacities for dark, dark, dark times, and people experience them. And I hold those just as close and feel them. And it gives me energy to say, not for me. I am going to do whatever I can in my world to make that not the reality. But in some ways, I feel like I need to see it in order to be able to know what I don't want. I have a very clear image of the world I do not want, and a clear conviction that within all of us there is the capacity for a different world. And so I go back and forth. In my day, I will absolutely work from a place of connection and hope, but I will allow the places of darkness to come into.
Well, my heartfelt thanks to the three of you for our time together here today and for the work that you're doing in the world. I think in conversation with each of you, it's pretty clear to me your eyes are open and you're not pretending to see something. You're more interested in seeing the reality of who and how we are and where we're heading. So perhaps our gathering here today is another example of the ability we have to find our fellow travelers and connect and share our heart mind with each other. And I'd agree with Nancy that when we're doing that, we've already won. I visited El Salvador back in the 1980s when the death squads funded by the US government were going around killing journalists and religious people, union people, student organizers, and so forth. I met a guy down there at that time, John Sobrino, who wasn't killed when the death squads attacked the house and killed his three Jesuits that he was living with at the time, because he was in Europe. But as soon as he got the word, he flew right back to San Salvador. And I met him shortly thereafter. We were talking, and I asked him about what brought him back, what kept him working, teaching, speaking truth to dreadful power that had gripped that country at that time. And he said to me, well, it's the knowledge that we've already won. I may die, they may come tomorrow and kill me, but they can't kill what we're doing here. We've already won. And that's why we're at peace and feel the confidence and feel highly motivated to wake up every morning and do what we do. I was working as a journalist at the time, not a psychotherapist. And I had some encounters with the other side there.
Mhm.
But at the end of our interview, he turned to me and he said, "So Daniel, when are you coming back?" His assumption was that anyone who wanted to be alive and be participating in something valuable would be right there on the ground with the death squads and the organizers, the Catholic nuns, and so forth. So I think we have a deep community of solidarity and fellow travelers that we can reach out to, connect with, inspire each other, grieve together, laugh together. And I'm very grateful to the three of you for forming our little bubble in that community here today.
Thank you very much. It's been
Right
very-
back at you, Dan.
Thank you.
Yes, right on.
Thank you, all of you, very much.